again, everyone. Now, I want to go over another enzyme question, and this one is about enzymes and experimental design. So here it says, the effects of pH and temperature were studied for an enzyme-catalyzed reaction. The following results were obtained, and you have two graphs here. The dependent variable, or y-axis on both graphs, is enzyme activity. Now notice there's no units here, but it has an arrowhead on the end of the line, and when it has the arrowhead, that is implying that data points with the larger value are closer to the arrowhead, and lower data points are at the bottom. And then the x-axis, or independent variable, on the first graph is temperature. The x-axis, or independent variable, on the second graph is pH. And both of them show an increasing enzyme activity, peaking at an optimum enzyme activity, and then decreasing. Same thing with pH. Now the question is asking you to describe a controlled experiment that would have produced the data shown for either temperature or pH. Be sure to state the hypothesis that was tested here. So here's what I think the key words are. Controlled experiment, so they want you to state what the control is. They say either or temperature or pH, which means pick one. Be both of them. And be sure to state the hypothesis that you're testing. Okay, so let's do temperature. Okay, so what would be our hypothesis for the enzyme? Well, I mean, since they didn't put numbers on here, your hypothesis could be anything having to do with the fact that the enzyme activity goes up, reaches an optimum, and then goes down. So for my hypothesis, I might put something like, my hypothesis is that the maximum enzyme activity is at room temperature, which is about 20 degrees Celsius is standard for room temperature, okay? All right, so that would be my hypothesis. So let's check that button, okay? They want you to design a controlled experiment. So my experiment would be, my IV, or independent variable, would be temperature. And of course, I'm just abbreviating it here, but you would want to write these in full sentences. And the temperatures I might test might be something like 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, and I don't know, 40 degrees Celsius, something like that. And then you pick one to be your control. And my control, I would say my control would be room temperature, 25 degrees Celsius, okay? My DV would be enzyme activity. And I would measure the enzyme activity at each of those temperatures. Now, another thing you might want to throw in if they ask you to design an experiment, so we've got our hypothesis, we have our control, we have our IV, and we have our DV. Those are the minimum things. Those four things are the minimum you should do when you design an experiment. Other good things to add is to say something about repetition. Now, what do I mean about that? If we want to test a new drug for COVID-19, are we going to test it on just one person and then be able to draw a conclusion from that? Of course not. So repetition might be is that I might measure the enzyme activity at each temperature. I'm having trouble. 3 times at each temperature. So I could take an average and get a better picture of how the enzyme behaves. 3 times, 5 times, something like that. Does that kind of make sense? Alrighty, so hope that helps. And just to summarize, if you're asked to design an experiment, make sure to clearly state what your hypothesis is. Make sure to state what your control is. Make sure to identify the IV and the DV. A couple other things that might appear in experimental design questions. You might be asked for a null hypothesis. Remember, our abbreviation for null hypothesis is H sub 0. And our standard null hypothesis is that there's no significant difference between the observed and the expected data. So that doesn't really apply to this question, but I just wanted to mention again the null hypothesis because it has shown up on the AP exam a few times in the past 5 years, and often students forget to do it. Null hypothesis, no significant difference between the observed and expected data. All right. Hope that helps. Bye.